Hello Studious Minds and welcome back to Pagan Philosophy, the channel where we strive to further our understanding of what it truly means to love knowledge. I feel like I'm saying this way too often, but forgive my absence. I know it's been a while. Things have been hectic and I wanted to keep you guys updated on some changes I'm going to be making to the channel. I want to reboot the Philosopher Bio series. What better way to start that than by starting the first episode off with Proclus. So as you know, Proclus was one of the last in a really long line of polytheistic philosophers that extend back to Plato and even before him to Pythagoras. One of the most important sources we have on Proclus is a man named Marinus, who was one of his students. This man was infatuated with Proclus. He was from Palestine. This means that he wasn't Christian or pagan. He was most likely a Jew or maybe a Samaritan. He writes a really lengthy biography on Proclus. He starts by saying that when Proclus was really young, he visited a temple of Asclepius, and one of the first signs he got from the gods that he was going to be a really important man was a young boy. Marinus writes, a beautiful young boy visited him in a dream late one night, and this young boy was Phorus, and this was an oracle from the gods that Proclus would do big and important things. Eventually, when Proclus became older, he moved to Alexandria, where he studied with some of the best and the brightest there. With time, he started to realize that the teachers weren't well equipped and that he felt they were misrepresenting some of the authors that they were teaching people. So he decided to move on and go to Athens. The first thing he did when he got to Athens, there was a shrine, a sacred place to Socrates. He didn't know it was sacred to Socrates. He went and he rested there, and he made a sacrifice at this shrine. But he didn't join the local Neoplatonic Academy right away. If you guys know the Neoplatonic Academy, it's been rebooted several times in Athens. It started with Plato, it was eventually destroyed during some invasions, but later on in late antiquity, it was rebooted and it was refunded. And it's restarted and it's more involved in what we call Neoplatonism, a newer branch of Platonic philosophy. Now, Neoplatonism goes back to Plato and goes back to Pythagoras. They melded Stoic, Neo-Pythagorean, and even some Cynic ideas together to make this new version, and their ultimate goal was to reconcile Aristotle and Plato. But as you know, Pythagoras, Plato, these people were really religious men, but they were polytheists, they were pagans. The Christians would have viewed them as worshiping false gods. And it's important to remember that by the time of Proclus's life, the Roman Empire would have been a Christian empire. They were already passing laws that was making pagan worship illegal. It was placing limitations on pagan priests. They were removing pagan officials like senators and prefects from their positions of authority. They were banning pagan schools. They were vandalizing polytheistic temples and recreating them as churches. But Proclus, he was a steadfast guy. He never converted to Christianity. He never left the traditional polytheistic faith. He kept Platonism pure, he kept Platonism pagan, he kept Platonism Greek. Now, there was a lot of Christian Neoplatonists. They were adopting the Christian Neoplatonic ideas and they were mixing it with biblical ideas instead of mixing it with the gods of Olympus. But regardless, Proclus eventually joined the school, first by catching the attention of a man named Syrianus. So Syrianus and his guys, they're there talking. And Proclus comes. The sun's going down, the moon's rising. Syrianus is trying to push Proclus to the side so he can sit with his guys and have an important discussion. But before Proclus leaves, he sees Proclus remove his shoes and get on his knees and start to worship the moon there in front of everybody. And Syrianus immediately took this as an omen. This guy, there's something important about him. They eventually invite Proclus into their homes, they invite him into their schools, they take him on as a student, and he begins to study Aristotle with them, he begins to study mathematics, physics, he studies history, and he studies philosophy. He eventually starts trying to move up in the school. But what happens is, because the local government officials are Christian, they start giving Proclus a hard time. And Proclus decides to go into exile for about a year. He leaves Athens and he goes to Asia Minor, to a city called Lydia. This apparently was a really important time for Proclus because Marinus writes that Proclus was keeping the old Pythagorean tradition alive of going unnoticed, remaining obscure, remaining anonymous. Don't make a spectacle of yourself. So he decides to leave, and in Lydia, he gets involved with the local traditions and the local customs. In Phrygia, in Anatolia, where Lydia is located, that section of the Greek world was firmly devoted to worshiping this goddess Cybele. Now, just some background on the goddess: she was kind of mixed with a local goddess named Agdistis, who was a mother goddess, and the story is that Agdistis was born with genitals of both male and female. This scared the gods, so they devised a plan where Dionysus would come. He would wrap a rope around his male genitals, around Agdistis's male genitals, and tie it to the other end of the rope to his ankle. And when he woke up and he started walking and he tried to get up, he yanked his foot and tore his male genitals from his body, leaving him only the female genitals. And it's at this point that they start to refer to this goddess no longer as a god, but as a goddess. The genitals, they remained on the floor, and in that spot, they sprouted a tree, an almond tree, where a local river spirit, a river nymph, comes and plucks one of the almonds and holds it close to her chest. This almond then ends up magically impregnating this river spirit, and she gives birth to a god named Attis. Now Attis, this whole story with Attis, this was a Greek, or we think this is a Greek addition to the original Cybele story. Cybele by herself was never really associated with a man named Attis, a god named Attis, until later on when she kind of came into the Greek world. But something similar happens to Attis. Attis was supposed to be the high priest of Cybele, but he ends up being given away to King Midas to be married to his daughter, to the princess. And because he does this and forsakes the love of Cybele for the love of a woman, Cybele in all her wrathful glory appears at the wedding, causing everybody to go insane. All the men cut off their genitals and all the women cut off their breasts, depending on what version of the story you're reading. Attis runs out of the temple and he runs under a pine tree, where he castrates himself and also bleeds to death. This cult was very Anatolian. It was local to Asia Minor. And when Proclus goes, he ends up being inducted into some of these religious mysteries, most likely the cult of Cybele. And when he returns to Athens, Marinus writes, by the guidance of Athena, he eventually keeps the religious traditions and the religious customs of Cybele in his practice. He stays devoted to her, and every month he observed her rites. But we've actually discovered the house of Proclus, and inside we found a statue of the goddess Isis. We found a pig sacrifice. So even though he was vegetarian, he refused to take on meat and eat meat. Even though his teachers like Syrianus were telling him that he should, he completely rejected it. Even though he didn't eat the meat, he still sacrificed animals. Seemingly, another person could have sacrificed it in his home for him after he died, but we think Proclus most likely sacrificed animals as part of his theurgy. But anyways, when he returns, Proclus, he becomes involved in a leadership position in the school. He eventually becomes the head of the Neoplatonic Academy, and he starts teaching people physics, he starts teaching people natural philosophy and mathematics and Aristotle and Plato, but most importantly, he starts teaching them theology. He starts teaching them Platonic theology. Marinus writes that they would often ask him, if you could only keep like 2 books for the future generations, which ones would you keep? Proclus says that he would keep Plato's Timaeus, and he would keep the writings of the oracles. This is most likely reference to the Chaldean oracles. These oracles were really important. They taught people how to engage with ritual magic and how to call on the gods. They were kind of a mesh of Platonist ideas with some Eastern Babylonian ideas. But with time, Proclus begins to grow old and he starts to suffer from old age. Marinus writes that he was suffering from something that sounds like it might have been Alzheimer's. He was forgetful. He would immediately be unable to remember people's names, who people were. He would forget literature that he had memorized his entire life. His suffering would be eased once his students started to recite hymns to the gods, and they started to read out these recitations in honor of the gods. Proclus would immediately remember them, and he would start to read along with them. But with time, Proclus passed away. Marinus writes that Proclus lived the most happy life that a human being has ever lived. He writes that he was beautiful, that he was a very attractive man, even though he never married. He makes it sound like he never took on a sexual partner. A lot like Hypatia, these people of virtue of Neoplatonist philosophers was that they were very physically appealing and physically attractive, even though they rejected romantic intimacy in favor of being married to their work, being married to the gods. So Proclus never had any children, but he did make lots of students and he impressed a lot of people. And we still have a lot of his works, and we have this biography by his student, Marinus. So I hope you enjoyed this video. In the comments below, let me know what you guys want to hear about. I'll do the research for you. We could learn together. If there's any figures or any stories, any moments in history that you guys are interested about, let me know. And I'll try to upload more frequently over the course of these next few months and try to keep you guys updated on all the goings on in the ancient world. But until next time, friends, stay studious.